So again, thank you so much for all being here today. And I'm really delighted to share with you some of what I learned while writing my latest book, Tracking the Golden Isles with University of Georgia Press. It just came out in May 2020, so I still consider it a new book. So it's fun to be able to share that latest book with you today and some of what like I said, what I learned from writing it, but also in communicating about it to other people, particularly people at Emory. So they're just two basic themes for today. One is about, as Holly was mentioning, I study traces. So what do traces, such as tracks, trails, burrows, nests, feces, etc., tell us about environments, interactions of organisms with their environments? But we're going to focus specifically on the Georgia coast today. And that would be the Georgia coast past as well as the near present. Also, I like to point out how we can use these traces of the past and the present to be able to predict the future of the Georgia coast. And what this does is it helps us better understand, particularly what's going to happen with regard to climate change and our mitigation adaptations to change along the Georgia coast as we go into the future. So there are four parts to the book. The way I broke it up was I wanted to have a natural history component that related to geology because I am a geologist. So how do traces tell us about the geological history or paleontological history of the Georgia coast? Part two, shells and carapaces, is about invertebrates and some of the more notable fun stories that you might gain from invertebrate traces on the Georgia coast. Part three, beaks and bones. You guessed it, these are vertebrates. So these would be birds in particular, but also mammals and some of the other animals, charismatic animals on the Georgia coast that have backbones. The last part then, for those of you who like people, and I like people, I like animals too, but how about humans? How do humans connect with the Georgia coast? And what sort of traces have they left in the long history of humans interacting with the Georgia coast? So that's going to be the last part of the talk. So part one, we're going to look at impressions of the past. How do we look at traces from the past, such as trace fossils, and compare them to what we see on the Georgia coast, which is famous, world famous for its modern traces that we use as models for comparing to what we see in the geologic past. Now, I am also an ichnologist. So I'm a geologist, I'm a paleontologist, but I'm an ichnologist. An ichnologist, as Holly said, is someone who studies traces. So a lot of people, the stereotype they might have of a paleontologist is like these scenes in Western Montana, where I'm on the Two Medicine Formation, I'm prospecting for trace fossils out there. And these rocks are about 75 million years old from the late Cretaceous period. Or you might imagine me along the Victoria coast in Australia, where I'm looking for dinosaur tracks or other trace fossils that might be in the Cretaceous rocks there. Those rocks are older than what we have in Montana. Those are anywhere from about 105 to 125 million years old. But is this ichnology field research? Riding my bike on the beach on Jekyll Island? Well, of course it is. And there are lots of ways that you can also be an ichnologist while you're riding a bike or just walking down the beach on one of the Georgia Barrier Islands. So while riding my bike with my wife Ruth one time, as we were going down the beach on Jekyll Island, November in years past, as we were going down the beach, we saw these clusters of little clams. And these little clams are dwarf surf clams. So you might wonder immediately, you get scientific questions like, why are these clams here? Why are they clustering there? This is where you can then become, through ichnology, a nature detective. Because as we stopped our bikes and we got off to investigate, we started realizing that these little dwarf surf clams were connected to this little flap of sand that you see right here. Well, beneath the flap of sand was a whelk. These are very large marine snails that live in the shallow intertidal to subtidal areas offshore on the Georgia coast. And these clams were clustering around the buried whelks. So that was kind of weird. Why was that happening? Well, with enough sleuthing as we went down the coast, we started realizing that the whelks were basically softening up the sediments. So as they were burrowing at low tide, they were exposed. They didn't want to become food for a seagull, for instance. So they started burying themselves using their muscular foot. In burying themselves, what they did then was they softened up or liquefied the sand around them. That then attracted these dwarf surf clams, who were also exposed at low tide and also didn't want to become a shorebird meal. So you can actually see these clams are burying themselves in the wake of this whelk right here. So why they were concentrated around the whelks is because they were using this quicksand effect of the whelks burrowing. As the whelks were burrowing, they were liquefying the nearby sand. So all of the dwarf surf clams were attracted to that because that made their burrowing much more easily. So with that happening though, here's the process. So you have the liquefying of the sand by the whelk. You have the dwarf surf clams concentrated in that area. But then what happened was, notice in this picture that a lot of the clams are missing. And you see holes there. You also see tracks. Who could have been the perpetrator? Who could have been attracted to this cluster of small dwarf surf clams right there? An all you can eat clam feast just waiting to get attacked. Well, you called it. This is the Sanderling, 28 grams of pure avian fury, the tyrannosaur of the tidal flat. At low tide, these prowl around at a cartoonish speed, chowing down on all of the invertebrates that are there in the intertidal zone exposed by the low tide. So what these sanderlings were doing, and they are one of my favorite birds to ever see on the Georgia coast. They're just so adorable. But as they're running along, they're not so adorable to the clams. The clams then are basically big targets for these where they unwittingly, in trying to bury themselves, concentrated themselves around the whelks, and the sanderlings were acting as ichnologists too, recognized those patterns as food, and started chowing down. So the traces are telling us something about whelk behavior at low tide that's causing this liquefaction. And there on the left, you see a very large whelk with its foot extruded. And you see this little operculum right here that it covers up that foot at low tide to keep from dehydrating. They burrow. That burrowing causes the whelks to get burrowed around them. So this actually, all of these traces then lead to a very complicated food web, all as a result of the tide going down and these birds, whelks, and the clams all interacting unwittingly with one another. So the red arrows are showing here where the sanderlings chow down on the dwarf surf clams, but then gulls entered the picture too, where gulls recognize these whelks as being buried. So sometimes they pluck them out, which also exposed these little crustaceans that were in the sand called amphipods that the sanderlings also chowed down on those. So like I said, a very complicated food web that you can interpret just from looking at the traces and just knowing who the perpetrators are in all of these instances of making these traces. So this is a great example of why I'm an ichnologist, because ichnology makes for good sleuthing, it makes for good storytelling. And a simple ride down the beach on my bike or walking down the beach can make for a very interesting natural history story. So now it's time for a little bit of geology. And the geology of the Georgia coast is actually tied in to the lower coastal plain. If you go down to the coastal plain, if you're driving down to the coastal plain, you'll notice as you get closer, you might go up over a sand ridge and down, up over a sand ridge and down. What you're doing is going over ancient barrier island chains. So geologists in the 1960s started realizing that some of these sand ridges that you see, these are given a mix of Native American and European American names here, these represent past shorelines and past barrier island chains. These go back to the Pliocene epoch several million years ago, where it shows you where sea level used to be. So you're basically driving over ancient remnants of barrier islands. Even on the Georgia coast, if you look at the current islands you have there, where you see here in the red, that's the ancient shoreline from about 40 to 45,000 years ago. These are called the Silver Bluff Islands. Those ancient islands actually make up the bedrock for some of the Georgia barrier islands. Where you see the yellow here, those are the Holocene Islands. This is where in just the last 10,000 years, as sea level went up after the last deglaciation with global warming that happened then, that these sands then got added on to the ancient sea line, ancient shorelines. So the sea level then is meeting that ancient sea level. So these are what we would call composite islands as a result. And you can see examples of that from satellite photos of some of those southern islands. So on the left, for instance, this is St. Catherine's Island, where you can see there's the Pleistocene core, there's the Pleistocene shoreline right there, where you see a lot of the maritime forest with the beautiful live oaks and other plants that are characteristic of those forests. And then you see over here, closer to the modern shoreline, these are the Holocene islands that are pasted on. Where they diverge is on Ossabaw. So if you go to Ossabaw Island, you will see it's actually a split shoreline where this Pleistocene Silver Bluff shoreline actually goes up to Skidaway, just north of there, and then the Holocene shoreline goes to Wassaw Island, just north of there. One of the ways that geologists figured this out in the 1960s, and they were Georgia geologists with the University of Georgia, the Marine Institute, they figured this out by finding trace fossils of ghost shrimp. And I'll talk a little bit more about ghost shrimp later on, but these are burrowing shrimp that leave very distinctive trace fossils that we can match up directly with the modern traces. So sometimes on the modern Georgia coast, you can go down along the shoreline and you might see these little pipes sticking up out of the sand with these little sand balls. Those are made by ghost shrimp. They also fossilize well. So this over here on the right, this is a trace fossil that we paleontologists call Ophiomorpha nodosa. That represents a ghost shrimp burrow from 40,000 years ago, and it tells us exactly where the shoreline was back then. So these are very sensitive paleoenvironmental indicators where we can say, when we find that ghost shrimp burrow, that fossil ghost shrimp burrow, we can say, there was the shoreline back whenever. And this is what a ghost shrimp looks like. Like I said, I'll come back to them because they're just magnificent animals for their burrowing abilities. Now, of course, if you go to the Georgia coast, one of the more famous aspects of the Georgia coast, and deservedly so, are its salt marshes. So if you've read any of Sidney Lanier's poetry regarding the marshes, and a lot of other poets and artists and photographers have been inspired by the marshes of the Georgia coast, understandably so, because they represent about 1/3 of all of the salt marshes that are left in the eastern US. These are just fantastic environments to view visually, but they're also ecologically very important in terms of their productivity. Now, I like to point out in my classes to my students, so this semester, for instance, I'll be teaching my Barrier Islands class. I like to point out to my students how these are actually ichnological landscapes as well as ecological landscapes. So for instance, the photo on the left, you're seeing oysters and you're seeing these little snails. If you go a little bit further in there, you'll also see mussels, for instance. They are all filter feeders that are pumping out feces and pseudofeces that is adding to the mud budget. Also, you see this cordgrass. It's a smooth cordgrass, Spartina, that's growing in there. It could not grow there if it weren't for the mussels providing that mud, but then also the mud is being stabilized by the root systems of the grasses. Over here on the right, these are fiddler crabs, among my favorite animals on the Georgia coast. These animals are burrowing and aerating the soil, but also they're recycling it. They're mixing up that soil and they're taking the nutrients coming down from the Spartina and they're recycling the nutrients so that there's this massive flow of nutrients happening every day along with the tidal cycles in the Georgia Barrier Island salt marshes. So actually, if you look at this from a aerial drone view, for instance, this is on Sapolo Island, I see an ichnological landscape, not just a landscape, but a landscape that is composed of traces from the behavior of millions of animals and millions of plants in those ecosystems. Now, what's cool to me as a geologist is if you go to the north end of Sapelo Island along Cabrera Beach, you'll see exposed at low tide a relic marsh. This relic marsh is actually from about 500 years old. It was buried, now it's been exhumed by natural processes, and you can see the brown there is all the nubs of Spartina, smooth cord grass, that used to grow in this marsh. Also notice I'm walking on it and I'm not sinking into it. So that is an example of how the mud in the marsh compacted over the last 500 years with a layer of sand on top of it compacted, so it's a lot more solid too. If you look at the top surface of that relic marsh from 500 years ago, here are 500-year-old mussels that are clustered there around the nubs of the smooth cordgrass. And if you look at it in cross section, you'll see burrows from fiddler crabs and you'll see the root traces made by the roots of the Spartina as well. So this is a great place for me to take my students, for instance, on field trips, where I show them this is how fossilization actually happens. We can actually watch these processes for trace fossils and body fossils in action happening right now on the Georgia coast. And then if you get a really good exposure of this relic marsh, you might even see where some of the ancient tidal creeks were located. So where you see the sand here on the right, that's filling in an ancient tidal creek. And over here on the left, here's a modern tidal creek. There's a great blue heron for scale right there and clumps of oysters. Here in the interior of this ancient tidal creek, you can also see some clams and oysters that are there that lived originally in that environment. So this is how geologists, paleontologists, and ichnologists use these modern environments and these near modern environments, their remnants, to be able to interpret what we see in the geologic past. One of the cooler observations I've had on this Relic Marsh II is that in some places you will see living Spartina that has colonized this ancient marsh surface. So now you have 500-year-old root systems mixing with modern root systems, which if you were a geologist looking at that in the geologic record and you thought that was all the same ecosystem, you would be wrong. So I add this as a cautionary tale to my geological colleagues of making sure that you think about these modern processes when interpreting the ancient ones. Okay, now we're moving on to invertebrates. And with the invertebrates, you will get many, many fascinating tales of their behaviors by looking at their traces. For one, on Cumberland Island, one time I had a group of students down there with some other faculty members where we saw these little bumps in the sand at low tide. These little bumps in the sand are Coquina clams. These are small clams, similar to dwarf surf clams, but different species. Donax variabilis is the species name. Here on the right, you're seeing dead shells. So those are dead bits and pieces of them. They have many colors and they are very small clams. What they do is they bury themselves at low tide and they'll actually move with the surf too. So they kind of crowd surf their way up and down beaches, and they actually, as I talk about in my book, they actually even seasonally migrate, which you think of great thundering herds of caribou. Well, in this case, think of great thundering herds of coquina clams. What's neat about coquina clams too is that they are so abundant and their shells sometimes get so abundant in the geologic record that they will make these limestone deposits. So if you go down to St. Augustine, Florida, for instance, the limestone that makes up the fort there, Castillo de San Marco in St. Augustine, is actually made of coquina limestone. So think about how these are the clams that actually changed history. If you know a little bit about St. Augustine and how this was a Spanish stronghold and how the British tried to take it over, but their cannonballs were actually repelled by the coquina limestone. Oh, this is one of my more favorite mysteries. I encountered with my wife Ruth. We were going down a beach on Sapolo Island. I think it was 2003 or so. Saw these impressions that perfectly fit the bottom of a ghost crab. So if you've ever seen a ghost crab on the Georgia coast, don't blink because they move very fast and you may not see it again. So these traces were a mystery because we could see that they had sat down and there were tracks leading away from them, but no tracks leading to them. So knowing they didn't parachute there or just jump into that place, we figured out that this was from them going down into the surf zone. They were sitting down and they were thirsty. So they've been out of their burrows all night because they normally live up in the dunes, but they do need water. So they go down to the surf and they hunker down and they soak up water through these hairy projections you see on their legs right here. So this is a ghost crab I caught in action. It was an example of where the traces provided a prediction that I was able then to test by going out and then a month later actually saw the ghost crabs doing this. And these were the traces they make. This was also a prediction where I dared my paleontologist friends look for these in the geologic record. And about 4 or 5 years later, after I published a paper about these, some Italian colleagues did find some Pleistocene, Pliocene examples of these from a few million years ago. So this is an example where the Georgia coast then, you can look at the modern traces just through casual observations and use those to help paleontologists get the right search images for what to look for in the geologic record. I promised you I was going to talk about ghost shrimp again. So ghost shrimp, they live in these little burrows that you see, these burrows that look like little volcanoes. So if you're ever walking along a Georgia beach and you see these little volcanoes, those are the tops of burrows of ghost shrimp. So the ghost shrimp, very, very rarely, I've only seen this twice maybe, and this was one time where luckily I had a bunch of Emory students with me, where a ghost shrimp will abandon its burrow. So here are the tracks, follow the tracks, and it actually led to the ghost shrimp itself. So this was a rare opportunity, and I was so glad I had it as a teaching example for my students, where you could see this ghost shrimp, for whatever reason, left its burrow. It buried itself because it was at low tide, did not want to become shorebird food. But then, fortunately, a gentle giant, me, put it back in the surf after showing it to my students, and we thanked it for the lesson it gave us. So these are incredible burrowers. They will burrow 2, 3, 4 meters down into the sand. They have these interconnected networks, these underground cavernous cities that are beneath your feet as you're walking along the Georgia coast. Now, in the summer times, after the horseshoe crabs have mated, baby horseshoe crabs will be born and they will then start burrowing. These burrows and these little trails that they'll make, sometimes you'll see these. If you look really closely at low tide, you'll see these, and these tiny ones that are not even bigger than your fingernail, you'll see exposed at low tide, burrowing along. This one over on the right is a little larger, but again, a small horseshoe crab. So the Georgia coast actually has the largest horseshoe crabs of any place in the world. A lot of biological, ecological reasons for that. But I love to point out that you can also look for traces made by the smallest of them as well. As they grow up and they get bigger, mating season is about late April into May, that the females come up onto shore by the millions along the eastern coast of the US. And on the Georgia coast, you can see them at low tide where they'll lay their eggs. The males try to hitch a ride on them. And then Mating happens. I won't have to draw a diagram for you, but this is actually the rare example of a marine invertebrate that has to use land in order to reproduce. So they actually come up on land, they lay their eggs, and then once the eggs are fertilized, they go out to sea, and then baby horseshoe crabs result. This trace over here is when a horseshoe crab, a mother horseshoe crab, was stuck on her back, and a colleague of mine fortunately saved her. A colleague of mine from Georgia Southern, he took these pictures, and this is from her spiky tail trying to right herself. So she did a little 360 kind of breakdancing move, but then eventually spiraled away from there once my colleague put her back onto her feet. And there she is going off toward the sea. So the ones I've often seen before I put them back in the ocean, they leave these fantastic traces showing all of the behaviors of where they are trying to get back to the water after they've laid their eggs or after they've come on shore, they're stuck at a low tide, and then what they're doing to try to get back. We sometimes find those in their tracks, literally dead in their tracks in the geologic record as well. This is one of my favorite traces, and it's one you might not notice it, or if you do notice it, you kind of wonder about it. Over here on the right, you'll see this perfectly circular hole that is in, say, a snail or a clam. Well, it is made by this snail. So actually, it is the same species of snail. This is Neverita duplicata, otherwise known as the shark's eye or the moon snail. Moon snails are ferocious carnivores. They are the lions of the tidal flat. What they do is they burrow through the sand. They find clams or sometimes other snails, and yes, even their own species. So what you're seeing here is a drill hole that is made by this carnivore, in which it then drilled in, inserted itself into there, and ate the interior of that animal. So this is actually not just a trace of cannibalism, not just a trace of predation, but of cannibalism. Now, I've mentioned to my students who think that, oh, this would make a great earring or this would make a great necklace because, hey, there's the hole for me, that they would be wearing a necklace of death. So I want you to keep that in mind too. Oh, yeah. I love these traces. They're rare, but occasionally see them on some of the southern Georgia Barrier Islands. These are crayfish burrows, and these are the tops of crayfish towers. Sometimes you might see them along floodplains in places throughout Georgia. Georgia is famous for its crayfish. We have about 70 different species of freshwater crayfish, but they are still on some of the Barrier Islands. So this is a little mystery, ecologically and geologically speaking, how these freshwater crayfish got on those islands. I have only seen one crayfish in all the times I've been on the Georgia Islands, but I've seen dozens of their burrows, so that tells me that they are on the islands. The one on the left here is from Jekyll Island, and the one on the right here is from Cumberland Island. So this is in Decatur, actually. I live in Decatur, and when the Decatur Cemetery, when they drained the pond that's there in the cemetery, all of these crayfish were exposed. So I got this nice close-up portrait of a crayfish, Procambris clarki, I think this one is, a crayfish coming out of its burrow and a little indignant that I was taking a close-up picture of it. Also, on the Georgia coast, if you look in the sand dunes, you might see these little half moon holes that are about the width of a pencil. These are made by wasps. These are sand wasps, that parasitoid wasps that will sting insects. And this is a horsefly, horse guard fly wasp, Stichtia signata. And this is a mother wasp who is digging a burrow so that she can take that paralyzed prey down there, lay some eggs on it, and there's fresh food for her young when they hatch. Well, what was cool about the photo here on the left, this was on Tybee Island, I took this. About 3 weeks later, I was doing field work in Montana, and I was working on these insect trace fossils that are near some of the dinosaur nest sites in western Montana. These show us that insects, including wasps, were burrowing very close to the dinosaur nests and in the same environments. So today, where we have shorebirds nesting, we also have wasp nesting. And the same thing was happening 75 million years ago in the Cretaceous period. Okay, we're on to vertebrates now, part 3, beaks and bones, getting into some of my favorite traces, especially of some of the more charismatic animals on the Georgia coast. So these are among my favorites for making me look around carefully to make sure they're not in the neighborhood with me. These are alligator tracks, and you can see the alligator tail drag right there. That's the front foot, that's the rear foot. You can even see the scale impressions there. This was from a very large alligator that I almost stepped on the next day. Longer story, I won't tell now. On the right, I want you to notice, and also on the left, I want you to notice, look at what fiddler crabs have done. This happened only in a few hours, where fiddler crabs then started erasing the evidence that that very large alligator was there. This was almost a 3-meter long alligator living in that area, going out on onto the sand flat at low tide. So this is an example of where you can see these fresh tracks. So this is a picture of my wife Ruth took me, where I'm looking at these alligator tracks from where this alligator came up out of the out onto the beach from the surf and walked over these dunes to a freshwater pond that was back there behind the dunes. So you can see these tracks while they're fresh. These were maybe only an hour old. The tracks on the right are about 3 to 4 hours old. This is where some ghost crabs were attracted to these low-lying areas created by the alligator tracks and tail traces, and they started walking along those. They started erasing all the evidence too. So I call this erasing the traces of a monster as a result of the crabs that are living in these areas will completely change that landscape within just a few hours. Now we were lucky enough, and this was funny to actually see. Finally, a couple of summers ago, we actually saw the alligators in the surf. We'd seen their tracks for years coming in and out of the surf, where they were going out for seafood every night. This we actually saw, I think it was summer 2018, where this alligator was out in the surf and got some beautiful portraits, close-up portraits, using a zoom lens, of course. I did not swim out there to take that picture, but seeing how they actually are in the water. So again, this is, a lot of people may think of alligators as freshwater only. Their traces say otherwise, and then act as predictors for this unseen behavior. This is one of my more fun little puzzles where a colleague of mine, Dr. Gail Bishop, who's done a lot of sea turtle research and conservation on the Georgia coast, he took these pictures for me and he gave this to me as a little mystery. This is from these traces you see here. It's actually a little story, and it's a bathroom story that involves a toad. This was from probably a southern toad that it went out onto the top part of the beach. Here it's bounding. It stopped. This was number 2. It backed up. Here was number 2. Here was number 1. Here was number 2 a second time. So the whole sequence of traces here of what this toad did just shows you can't keep any secrets on the beach when there are ichnologists around. Among my favorite bird traces, and I could have done a talk just on bird traces because I love birds and I love bird traces, but among my favorite bird traces are these of their flying. These are from a great egret when it came in for a landing. You see as it came in for a landing, one foot is in front of the other, and you see this very long trace caused by its rear toe. So when its rear toe contacted the sand, it slowed it down, but you also see that long scratch caused by that rear toe and that claw. Because I had seen thousands of these on the Georgia coast for more than a couple of decades, I was lucky enough to have that search image when I saw this in the Museum of Museum Victoria in the middle of Melbourne, Australia. I saw this track. This is from a Cretaceous bird that landed on a sandbar alongside a river 105 million years ago. So this tells me that this is one of the oldest bird tracks in Australia. When we publish that paper, we could also say from that one track, yes, that bird was also coming in for a landing from flying. So this is where traces again give us a search image to be able to interpret behavior that we could not observe from the fossil record. Yeah, and here's a close-up of that track where that bird came in for a landing. Oh, and I drew this when the research paper came out. Carol Clark wrote a press release to go with this, and I drew this so that as an illustration, people could better visualize how this bird would have made that trace as it was landing with that rear toe. Other mystery traces that we've seen, there's my wife Ruth there for scale. Other mystery traces we've seen are these really lengthy burrows that I had no idea what they made. I thought maybe it was a ghost crab. And in science, we don't prove, we disprove. I later found out I was totally wrong. These were made by moles. And these are actually moles that then burrow both close to the beach as well into the interior of the island. So both of these are on Sapolo Island on the Georgia coast, for instance. Among the more fun traces to encounter are those of river otters. And even on the Emory campus, we have river otters that are living in the streams there. So I had a lot of experience with seeing those river otter tracks on the Emory campus in low water. Once in a great while, even on Peavine Creek or in Baker Woods, I'll see river otter tracks. And again, that helps me better observe them and the behaviors of the otters and them having a really good time as they go for a trot down the beach there on the Georgia coast. Okay, now we're going to get to humans. So those of you who like humans or you're anthropocentric, you're in for a treat now. Because the Georgia Barrier Islands have had a continuous human presence for minimum 4,500, more likely 5,000 plus years, the Georgia Barrier Islands are very different as a result of what is often called a pristine environment that you might have in mind. On the left, for instance, that is an armadillo burrow. Armadillos are recent migrants to the Georgia coast. They only started getting there in the 1970s. On the right, I'll tell you the story about these rocks that you may recognize from some of the older roads in the historic part of Savannah, Georgia. So one of the points I like to make to my students about the Georgia coast, if you go to any of the Georgia Barrier Islands, they have invasive species, including very obvious tracks and other traces of invasive mammals. So for instance, the big four that I like to point out are feral cats that you see on a lot of the islands that also have a major human presence. Feral cattle that are on Sapolo Island now, but were on some of the other islands. Feral hogs that are on actually four of the islands I have there. And then of course the famous Cumberland Island horses that are feral there. So I like to point out also how these invasive mammals then change the landscapes of those islands. So for instance, here on the left, that is a trail made by the feral cattle, the wild cattle that are on Sapolo Island. And over on the right, this is one of the trails made by some of the feral horses on Cumberland Island on the Georgia coast. Now on Sapolo, the wild cattle, you may go there as I have dozens of times and never see them. I've seen them out of all the times I've been there on Sapolo, I've seen them maybe 3 times. But if you find their tracks here on the beach, you know they actually come to the beach, which is rare, but they do that. They mostly live in the forest. And this one right here, some of my colleagues from the Center for Digital Scholarship were lucky enough to be able to get video footage of this giant rogue bull that was wandering there in the forest. Do not approach these animals. They are dangerous as wild animals. On the Cumberland Island, the wild horses there have very much changed those environments. So the horses, having been there since the time of the Carnegies in the 20th century, they have modified the environments there by eating the sea oats and trampling over the sea oats so that there's actually more erosion of the sand there. And I have a picture of them there as a result. So I actually had an undergraduate student do her honors thesis on this topic where Arbor Guthrie, she mapped these a couple of years ago. She did this where you could actually observe these trails in satellite maps going back to 1999. And with this, then she was able to map how these trails changed over time, and that the trails actually did lengthen, they actually did change the environments, and they had an overall ecological impact there on the southeastern end of Cumberland Island. Hogs are actually the worst. Hogs are the worst in terms of their impact on the islands. What they do is they eat a large variety of material from every ecosystem. So over here on the left, that's in the salt marshes. And you see some of the hogs there running away from us upright bipeds because we often carry boomsticks with us. And over here, you're seeing this is in the back dune meadows. This is where, for instance, sea turtles might nest. And these hogs then will eat every egg in a sea turtle nest. So they're very bad for sea turtles. This one over on the left is on St. Catherine's Island. This one on the right is, this is in the beach areas of Cumberland Island. Humans, like I said, have been on the Georgia coast for a long time. So these invasive mammals are more recent from the Spanish on. But before that, humans were living on the Georgia Barrier Islands. Native American tribes, such as the Wali, for instance, were leaving these gigantic shell rings. And shell rings have been documented from at least 5 islands that I can think of right now. And these are very large structures, about 100 meters across here. This one on the Sapolo Island one, there's a roof there for scale in this cross section of the famous shell ring that's on Sapolo Island. So these are large structures in which the people were modifying the landscapes there on the Barrier Islands more than 4,000 years ago. What happened then, fast forward to plantation times when enslaved Africans were used by the Europeans and then later the Americans for the plantation economy there on the islands. They then actually mined those shell rings. Yes, you heard me correctly. They mined those shell rings, those Native American shell rings, and then they used those to make the tabby. That's the architecture used during that plantation era. So these are traces of both Native American shell rings and enslaved people on the Georgia coast. Speaking of traces of enslavement on the Georgia coast, if you go to the historic part near the riverfront of Savannah, you will see these stones that are set down there. Now, me as a geologist, when I took a close look at these stones, I recognize these are not from around there. There are no rocks like these anywhere, not only on the Georgia coast or in the lower coastal plain, but in the rest of Georgia. So these rocks probably came from Europe. And I'm showing there are some body fossils. Those are crinoids there in that limestone. And these are probably the tops of fossil burrows right there. These all probably came on ships during the plantation economy time, where the ships came over with ballast stones. And the ballast stones, they actually drop then along some of the tidal channels. So these are ballast islands that you can see as you're taking the ferry over to Sapelo Island. Look for these clusters of trees. These are ballast islands. This is the satellite photo in which those ships dropped their ballast, and then they took cotton, indigo, and other goods then from the enslaved labor there on the Georgia coast back to Europe. So again, these are traces on the landscape of these economies. Now, the big trace we have happening right now of human interactions with the Georgia coast and human interactions in general are from climate change. So we have hurricanes that Matthew and some of these other hurricanes that have happened, Irma, and other hurricanes that are happening more frequently, that are becoming more ferocious. On the left, these are uprooted trees on Ossabaw Island, and this is a causeway that was washed out after Hurricane Matthew on Ossabaw. So these hurricanes, this is a trace of climate change in which now climatologists are predicting we're going to be seeing some major changes from hurricanes on the Georgia coast. What happens with this then is the trace makers, the animals and the plants, move with them. This is a storm washover fan where you see this sand that's been washed over, and some of you may recognize this area. This is on the north end of Jekyll Island. There's the famous Boneyard Beach that's on the north end of Jekyll Island. What's happened is with sea level going up with climate change and storms is causing the sand from this beach to then wash over the salt marsh. So the salt marsh is now changing more into a beach as a result. This I observed from the bike path. So Hurricanes Matthew and Irma, both washed out this bike path. That's right here, going to the north end of Jekyll. And you can see the sand is now starting to go into the salt marsh. This took place in about 10 years total time it took for this to happen. So now what we're predicting, we geologists are predicting, is that this sand is going to be extending all the way to the road that's over here, all the way over to the road here in another probably 10 to 15 years or so, as sea level goes up, as storms become more frequent. This is where geologists are handy to have for predicting what's going to happen, because here's from St. Catherine's Island, a colleague of mine, Andy Rensburg, and I, we studied these Pleistocene storm washover deposits that had fiddler crab burrows and other traces in them. We are able to interpret, these are about 1 meter above current sea level. So what we're predicting is that these ancient storm washover deposits can give us an idea of what's going to happen with current sea level rise as these storm washover deposits start changing the environments on the Georgia coast. So basically the past is the key to the present. So here's a prediction then from University of Georgia River Basin Center, where with 1 meter rise, which is predicted for about the next 100 years or so, by the end of the 21st century, 1 meter rise, this is how Jekyll Island is going to look. That a good number of, good percentage of the area that's on Jekyll is going to be underwater as a result. And a lot of the area back barrier just west of Jekyll Island is also going to be underwater. And the trace makers will move with them then. So this abstract art that you see here on the left, this is a good example because I'm an artist too. So with my science, I like to combine them. On the left, this is actually not just an abstract art piece. This is a scientific hypothesis. So what I'm showing you here, decoded here on the right, is these are traces you would see in a section of sand from bottom to top of where you would have a back dune meadow going into the top part of a beach, a berm, with the traces you would get from that area. Then you would get, with sea level going up, sea level keeps going up, then you would get down into the runnels, the intertidal sand flat. So you're getting more marine animals. As sea level continues to go up, then you're going to see those laterally adjacent environments succeeding one another vertically. Then you will see traces from more of the offshore animals. So it's art and it's science. You get them both together when you use traces to predict what's going to happen with the Georgia coast with climate change. So just to summarize and review, traces tell us stories. They can tell us small stories. They can tell us big stories about the natural and human histories of the Georgia coast. And these stories then we can use for the past, present, but we can also use them to predict what's going to happen in the future of the Georgia coast. So if you want to read more, you can get my book, my latest book, Tracking the Golden Isles, in which I have a series of essays that tell the details of some of the stories that you just got teasers to. You could order it directly from UGA Press. That's what I recommend. Don't buy it from Amazon. Or you could ask your local independent bookstores or even your public library. Have them get it for you. You can also, this is an ongoing project I've had with the people from Center for Digital Scholarship at Emory, where we've been doing the Georgia Coast Atlas. So check that out. It's a work in progress since 2015, in which we have a digital atlas with video, maps, still photos, text, and so on that is informing you about the Georgia Barrier Islands. So go to that. Totally free. Check it out, georgiacoastatlas.org. Okay, and because you're all retired faculty, I thought this was an appropriate picture to have because you don't have to go teach class after this. So thanks to everybody for listening, and I always thank the trace makers as well for making the traces because they made this then kind of talk possible. So now I'm going to stop screen share and I'm going back to me.
Well, thank you so much, Tony. That was fantastic, and we'll now have our Q&A session. And so it's perhaps going to be a little bit confusing today because depending on what version of Zoom you have, the raise hand is going to be in two places. If you haven't updated recently, it's going to be click on the participant list and the blue hand at the bottom. If you have upgraded, it will be in the reactions button on the main Zoom screen and a raise hand. And so use either of those to raise your hand and we'll call on you. And I see Rosemary McGee has her hand raised, so we'll go to her.
Thank you. And really thanks to you, Tony, for just a very thorough but quick survey. As you know, we've talked about in the past intermittently that I have family relationship to several of the barrier islands, including Wausau, Ossabaw, St. Catherine's Island,
Right.
and others. And I'm curious to know, and would love to talk with you now that I'm retired in more depth about those connections and insights. But I'm curious to know if the feral animals migrate from island to island, and if so, how they might do it or how they may have done in the past. I'm pretty sure that I've seen feral boars, not to the extent that you see at Ossabaw, but on Wausau Island, for instance. And if they do migrate, how they are managed so that they don't overrun the island. Which I know other animals such as deer can be problematic for the ecology of the island as well. But I'm particularly curious about the feral animals and if they migrate, how they might do so.
Great. Thanks for asking that, Rosemary. And yeah, I knew about your connection with the Georgia coast. So I was really happy to see that you were with us today and that you could ask such questions because you might have been there much more often than me and and hence you would observe a lot of this. Your question then does relate to a major problem then. This is why I like to teach about these traces and recognizing the traces. Like, does my island, my pristine island, have wild boars, for instance? And Wausau Island has largely kept boar free, but they swim. And you may have observed them swimming, but they are actually fairly good swimmers. So occasionally the ones from Ossabaw, which is overrun with hogs. The very first time I went to Ossabaw, my ichnovision was overwhelmed with hog sign. It was everywhere. So it's not surprising then that sometimes, especially during low tide, they're able to do that distance. Now, from what I understand, though, it's not that common. And the people I know who are there on the islands more often or have seen the sign more often, such as say John Crawford or Crawfish and some of the other naturalists there, Carol Ruckdeschel, for instance, when I've asked them this, they say, yeah, it's relatively rare for them to get off the islands, but they do. Now, the cattle, as far as I know, have never done that. On Sapolo, they've always stayed there on that island. And then the horses, same thing. That although I haven't been on Little Cumberland yet, I'm not sure how often the horses get over to Little Cumberland. But yeah, the hogs are a huge problem in that respect. And
Right.
that's these wildlife management areas. They think they're hog free, and then next thing you know, they're not. Yeah, I hope
Okay,
that answers your question.
it does, and I'll be getting back in touch with you with some other thoughts.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for asking that.
Thank you.
I see Gretchen has her hand up.
Yeah, hi, Tony. And
Hi,
by the
Gretchen.
way, I sent Steve Henderson a note that you were talking today, and he's here as well. I'm glad to see
Good.
that.
My partner in crime, I always call Steve.
I have heard about it over the years. Yeah. I have a question about, well, you mentioned that this semester you're going to be teaching your Barrier Islands class and taking students on one or more field trips. And I know you've been doing that over the many years. I'm just wondering how the pandemic situation has affected that, but also just what that experience is like for the students, how long they're able to be there, and what you all do when you're there.
Okay, yeah, thanks for asking that, Gretchen. Because over the years, what happened was starting in 1997, Steve Henderson and I co-taught a field course called Modern and Ancient Tropical Environments, and I still teach it biannually. What we did was for the students, we wanted to give them an island field experience first, where we would do it on a weekend, and we would do it on Sapolo Island, whereas sometimes a literally immersive experience where they're on this island for a couple of days. We go over on a Saturday morning on the ferry. We're there at the Marine Institute, and we get a really intense, almost 2-day experience on this island where students get that experience. Then later, we will go on a 10 to 14-day field trip
Oh, yeah.
to the Gerace Research Center, which is on San Salvador Island in the Bahamas. The last time I did that was in March, which was and it actually happened during the pandemic.
Mhm.
So we were actually, I bragged about it, but it was also a little sad that I think we were the last Emory College class that actually met in person that semester, because we were on San Salvador Island in the Bahamas when it was announced. Everybody got the same email, Emory's closed. Back to your previous question, how is this affecting my teaching of the class? Sadly, we will not be able to do a field trip. I just responsibly cannot have students cooped up in vans on a 5-hour drive down to the coast and back. No, we're not going to do that. So I am going to teach it, unfortunately, virtually. The fortunate part of that is I will be able to have more students in the class. So that's the good thing.
Oh, yeah.
More generally, related to how this improves student learning, is that they actually get this real life experience where they get to be kind of kids again with their scientific inquiry. They can go, Dr. Henderson, Dr. Martin, Dr. Hayes, what's this? And that's one of the most basic scientific questions, curiosity questions we can ask. But sometimes in our formal educational system, we've kind of beaten that out of kids by the time they get to college. Well, this gives them a chance then to get back in touch with that form of natural history curiosity. And we try to give them the right tools then that they can continue taking that with them, that sense of wonder, that sense of inquiry with them when they leave the island or any other field experience they have with us. I hope that answers it.
Oh, yeah, that's just wonderful. I mean, you've given us a feel for what that feels like just through the virtual experience today. Thanks
Great.
so much.
And Kerry Bynum has his hand up.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Martin, for this wonderful presentation today. We've spent a lot of time in these islands, all from Tybee to Cumberland, and you filled in a lot of questions and gaps for us, the things that we certainly have wondered at, but have never quite known what was going on in this. One question I had was in St. Simon's, they had put along the coast and the beach to reinforce the beach, they put up these big boulders. And in the midst of these boulders, we observed over a summer, in several summers, these large, almost roach-like animals crawling around there and could never quite figure out where they came from or what they were. And I was wondering if you had any, I had basically observed these and had some answers.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. I'm glad you asked about that, Carrie, because what happened on St. Simon's, and I remember being just amazed the first time I saw those on St. Simon's,
Yeah.
where they put in this, it's called riprap, these huge boulders of metamorphic rock that were shipped down from the Piedmont. And I hate to think about the carbon footprint of that.
Yes.
But in this vain effort to prevent coastal erosion, actually accelerated erosion. I teach about that in my class. later in the semester. First time I went to St. Simon's, I saw those animals and I thought, what the heck are those? They're crustaceans, and they're crustaceans that are particular to hard substrates. You will not see them in the sandy or muddy environments, but they are marine crustaceans. Oh gosh, I can't remember even what the common name is for them right now, but I'd never seen them before
Yeah.
because rocks are so rare on the Georgia coast. It takes people to put the rocks there, and then that's like an attractant for these crustaceans. So what they do is they graze on the surfaces of those rocks. So the rocks are the perfect place for them to be, and that's why you'll see it's like I don't know, the golden corral of crustacean buffets for them. That's why you'll see thousands of them at a given time at low
Thank you
tide.
very much. Just a quick note that somebody was asking me if I had known anything or had any information about on the Georgia coast in the Isles, Blackbeard Island. And of course, they had not seen that it was Blackhead Island. They had read that as Blackbeard. So I had no information about that, and finally looked at the map, and it was Blackhead Island. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome. Yep.
Wonderful, and thank you again. You have made me believe that I too could be an ichnologist.
Yes. I've converted you to the Church of Ichnology. Very good.
Thank you.
Substrate, anatomy, behavior. That's the holy trinity of the
All
House
right,
of Ichnology.
lovely, lovely. I have one comment and then a question about the early map that you showed us about the changing shapes and constituencies of those islands. My observation is sound. The last time I visited Cumberland, I made a special point to listen to the different musics of the winds and the silence in the trees in the undergrowth. And that's another whole study. And you as an artist, I'm sure, are very aware of the way in which sound is part of the environment. But that's another discussion. See, you stimulate in us all these things. The little question I have, it's a very minor one, is I noticed that Cumberland Island seemed to have the most congruency between the early shape and the present shape. Is that true, or is it just because of the size of the island?
Yeah. So actually get into your first point about sound. This is something that the Center for Digital Scholarship, one of my colleagues, Steve Bransford, he's a videographer. So he wants to start capturing some of those sounds.
Oh, beautiful.
And having those sounds associated with 360-degree panoramas that now you can actually turn with virtual reality goggles. You could actually then turn your head and you would pick up the sounds of, say, the salt marsh versus the maritime forest versus the beach. So I did want to point that out.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, and the second part of it was related to Cumberland. Cumberland is the largest barrier island on the Georgia coast by area. It is actually the size of Manhattan, is one of the little trivia points we like for people to use for comparison. Fortunately, not as populated as Manhattan. But with the shoreline, the current shoreline, because you're at the southernmost part of the Georgia Barrier Island chain, we have this artificial boundary between Georgia and Florida. Amelia Island, just to the south, shares exactly that same coincidence. That has Pleistocene on the west side of the island, and then pasted on top of it is the Holocene. This would be like, those of you who remember the old duck on the Emory campus.
Yeah.
Remember the new part of the duck that was pasted onto the old part, the old building. And it's lovely now to see the old building seeing sunshine again. But that's how I then explain the Georgia Barrier Islands, is that you have that older part on one side, and then you have the newer part, those new sediments that have been pasted onto and on top of those older sediments. So on the southern part of the Barrier Island chain, they are going to be more coincidental. What happens as you go north up to Ossabaw, then they split. And then they split off that way.
Excellent.
Yeah. Thanks for asking that.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tony. That was terrific. I'm glad that you brought up Amelia Island because I have a home on Amelia Island, and my question was about this thing that they do. I've had the place for about 20 years. And it seems to happen, gosh, really often, but I think about every 10 years, where they have renourished the beach and they've piped in huge amounts of sand. And I'm wondering what the effect of that is on on I mean, obviously it's going to cover up traces, but that land wouldn't even be there if they didn't keep bringing in that sand. Is this, I don't know if this is being done in the Georgia Islands also in some places, or or what, but what is the effect when something like that happens? Where does all that come from?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because that's one of the main topics I cover with my students in the Barrier Islands course in the last couple of weeks about barrier island management, and these barrier islands that have a lot of people on them. So Amelia Island has people on it, then St. Simon's or Tybee Island, where because of people wanting to be next to the beach, but the barrier island is dynamic, change is the constant. I like to point out that Zen Buddhist kind of concept there, that change is the only constant of these barrier islands, that people want the beach to be in the same place and to stay the same. So they've put in like the riprap, or they'll put in seawalls, or they'll add more sand when the sand is eroded away. And it's all in vain. They should just let it be. Now, with that said, though, I've been watching very carefully what Tybee Island has been doing. And Tybee, I think, finally, they're not just dumping more sand, because what the sand does when you dump it like that, it chokes out a lot of the invertebrate animals that are living offshore. They literally choke to death. They're buried and they can't suspension feed. So renourishment is actually an oxymoron in that respect. But what they did on Tybee just a few years ago is they realized they needed to rebuild the dunes. So they dumped a bunch of sand more in the dunes and they started planting sea oats there. They did, and I was so impressed with how brilliant this was, because I had students there on a field trip in 2019 where we were going by this restoration effort. And I was like, wow, looks like they actually did a pretty good job here, that they were planting the sea oats and they had the big artificial dunes already started in the backshore area. They also put up signs that said, danger, rattlesnake nesting area.
It's great. Instead of just keep off the dunes.
It's like, damn, that was good. That person deserves a raise. Whoever thought it, because it actually is an area where you might find rattlesnakes. On Tybee, probably not. But nonetheless, I was so impressed with the brilliance of that, because one of the big problems is people walk across the dunes, and then that's going to erode all of the dunes and all of that effort to making the dunes act as a natural barrier for that beach there on Tybee. So anyway, I think on Tybee so far, they're doing a good job with their dune restoration there.
Amelia has done some of
Okay,
that
are
as
there
well.
other questions? I don't see
been
any
somewhat
hands.
successful, but
Oh
they have
yes,
that
Gretchen
huge
has
expanse of
her hand
sand,
up.
an enormous beach, which
Yeah.
is delightful when you're there.
I was-
Yep, but it's always changing. It can't stay the same year to year.
Giving other people a chance to go first. You hadn't said too much about the turtle situation, Tony, and I'd like to hear you say a little bit more about that. I had some wonderful time on Hunting Island quite a while ago now, but went on one of those sea turtle walks in the night. And I remember the warnings about the extent to which all the lights on shore were confusing the turtles and that sort of thing. How are things with the turtle population?
Actually, much better. I'm glad you mentioned that, because those are among the most charismatic animals on the Georgia coast, and especially if you've ever looked at or held a baby sea turtle, oh my gosh, the cute is enormous in that. It's off the scale cuteness. So people really get into that as a conservation issue. What's happened now is we're seeing actually, this is the long-term planning of conservation biology related to turtles, we are now seeing turtles coming back. Sea turtles are actually coming back because the conservation efforts of their nests has been 30 plus years in the making.
Mm.
And mother sea turtles, it takes about 30 to 35 years for them to become sexually mature, to come up on shore, and they often lay their eggs in very close to the same places where they were born. So what we're now seeing is all of that reaping of the conservation biologists who were watching over those nests, were monitoring the nests, saving the baby sea turtles, making sure they go back out to sea. 30 plus years later, we're now sowing. It's really fantastic to see what we're seeing happen from the past. Now is catching up in a very positive way and says, see, we need long-term planning for our conservation efforts on the Georgia coast. And sea turtles and the Georgia Sea Turtle Center on Jekyll Island I think is a really good place to go to learn more about this. So if you go to the Jekyll, and if you can go there, how sea turtles are really kind of a hook ecologically for a lot of people to understand how important all of the conservation efforts that we're doing on the Georgia coast, using sea turtles as an example, all of them need to have long-term planning as part of the goal.
Oh,
Yeah, thanks for
that's
asking about them.
great news. Yeah.
Yep.
And I have, I don't see another hand. Another question, we're going to have Talea Mayo come talk to us. And she's a young professor in math who works on storm surge, on hurricanes and
Oh,
storm
yeah, I
surge.
haven't met her.
And
Right.
so we've got that coming up February 8th, I think. We're looking forward to that. But in that connection, I was just wondering about the extent to which uh, the Georgia coast, the islands in particular, have been impacted by the terrible hurricane damage that's been done quite recently along that area. I mean, not to mention the change that's always happening, right? This kind of change in particular.
Yeah, I talk about that in detail in my book, Tracking the Golden Isles, where toward the end of the book, I get into storms and then climate change with sea level rise. And what we're going to see is as sea level rise goes up, then the storm surge is going to be worse. So storm surge is, especially if it coincides with a high tide. The Georgia coast, I didn't mention this during my talk. The Georgia coast is also unique in that it's mesotidal. It actually has tidal ranges between 2 to 3 meters, which is significant. So if we have sea level going higher, and then we have a more ferocious storm, so this is where the mathematical modeling is really important, because then we can model that with a high tide, with a higher sea level and a more ferocious category of storm. If all of those coincide, it's going to be much worse than in the past. Now, in fact, my background today is a storm washover fan that's on Sapolo Island. I took that picture about 4 years ago. The sand you see behind me is just then starting to cover the green that you see behind me, which is a salt marsh. The last time I was there in early 2020, in February, just a little over a year ago, that marsh was gone. That marsh was completely covered by sand.
Wow.
Yeah, and that was from storms. Just in 3 to 4 years, that marsh got covered over by sand. So these changes are going to be very rapid. And this is where we geologists work closely then with geophysicists and meteorologists, climatologists, and mathematicians to be able to try to predict what we're going to see and what's going to happen.
Gretchen, this is Malin DeLong. Could I ask a question?
Sure, Malin, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I can't get my hand to work. I had, this is wonderful. Our family, we've spent a lot of time at Trip Island, which we discovered many years ago when we came and fell in love with it. I know it's the bad island in a sense of being a rock fortress, but it seems to have worked. I wondered what your thoughts were about that. And, you know, Hunting Island next to it, of course, has been demolished by all of the changes or the weather and erosion. But this is like I mean, it has not changed much since the last 20 years is what I can see.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at the long-term effects of shoreline management,
Yeah,
and we can
yeah, that's
actually,
what it,
yeah, we can actually use Jekyll Island as an example. And that Jekyll, after a bad hurricane, I think it was Dora, it might have been Hurricane Dora, that was in the 1960s. Lyndon Johnson, who was president then, actually threw a bunch of money at the Georgia coast for Jekyll in particular. And then that's when they built their seawalls and put in the riprap and all that. A lot of it got buried because the shoreline shifted. So it's interesting because sometimes I've gotten pushback from longtime residents of Jekyll Island who say, well, it's always worked. And I was like, has it really? Because what happens is the shoreline is always shifting, and sometimes the rocks will actually get buried and then they'll get exhumed later on. So as the shoreline shifting, when you put in those rocks too, which they just recently did on the north end of Jekyll after the last couple of hurricanes, there are some very expensive condos close to the shore. So I know why they put in new seawall, new riprap, and really awful excuse for dune restoration. As soon as I saw that, I said, no sea turtle is ever going to nest there.
Yeah.
It's on the same island as the Jekyll Sea Turtle Center, the Georgia Sea Turtle Center. It's on the same island, but there's no way a turtle's going to be able to nest there. So then that's where you start making management decisions as to how's this going to affect people in very expensive condos in the next 10 years versus sea turtles that need 30 plus years for their nesting cycles. So I'm just throwing that out there as a partial answer to a complicated question. Kind of a question with a question.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
My question concerns the migration of the Donax coquina clams. I also have observed one time they'll be there, the next time they're not. But my question is, I've never given it much thought, are they migrating in response to warmer or colder water temperatures? And how far do they migrate? Do you have any ideas on that? Any knowledge?
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Steve. And Steve, of course, as I mentioned, is a longtime colleague of mine with co-teaching Emory students, particularly on field courses. And we've co-taught courses out in the Western US as well. And Steve, I'll brag about him, is an expert on mollusks. So he knows all about these clams and snails on the Georgia coast, and I often would defer to his knowledge on this. So I'll do my best to answer that. Yes, it is both seasonal as well as, so it has to do something with the water temperature, must be triggering it, that they actually move up and down the beach. And I can't remember exactly whether they go up in the beach during winter or down, but it's maybe just by a couple of meters or so. They will move en masse. On a daily basis with the surf, they actually will ride the surf. So what will happen is the waves will actually pick them up, wash them out of the surf, drop them, and while the sand is still liquefied, then they instantly bury themselves.
I know they'll bury themselves in your hand.
They will. You can pick them up. Exactly. You can pick them up. And Steve was with me. Actually, when I took the pictures I showed of the Donax under the sand, you can actually take them, put them in your hand, the live ones. Dead ones, I don't recommend doing this. You'll be standing there a long time. But when you have the live ones in your sand in your hand, they will bury themselves instantly right there in your hand. But they also will shift seasonally. And I think I did cite some of the original references on that in my book, Tracking the Golden Isles, just in case you're missing a copy and you don't have it. I don't remember anymore. You'll have to buy the book and read it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and I know that Liza has a question.
There I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, good, Tony. Thank you so much. My son took your Barrier Islands course several years ago, and it was
gosh, that's
a highlight
fantastic.
for him. Yes, it was.
What was his name?
Stefan Buga.
Oh yeah, I remember Stefan. Sure, yeah. Great.
But my question is, have you? I'm in literature, and I've learned so much from your talk. But have you read any of Carl Hyacint's books?
Yes, I have,
Okay.
and I love his writing style in that he of course does really wacky. Those of you who haven't read Carl Hyacin, he does really wacky, ecologically oriented, typically plots that are often sordid murder mysteries, but with unbelievable characters. But all you have to do is like, actually, they're not that unbelievable because they start out with the words Florida man, and then he goes on from there. He just builds his stories from there. So yes, I have read them, and it would be kind of fun if somebody did apply that kind of fiction to say the Georgia coast, because I'm sure the Georgia coast has equally crazy stories to tell that would be thinly veiled fiction.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just an interesting point, if I can state it very quickly. I know our time is up, but Carl Hyacin attended Emory for a time. He did not graduate from Emory, and it's kind of lost in his resume, but there was a period of time, maybe a year or so, that he was an Emory student.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, I do remember that now that you mentioned it. Yeah, I'd forgotten about that. Okay.
Gretchen's question raised, I think, an interesting issue that with your traces, you are having to sort of make guesses about what is happening at night when you're not observing. So then the question is, well, what can you observe at night? And of course, one way of doing that would go out there with big lights and shine lights and look and so forth, but that obviously is going to interrupt what happens. However, what is possible now fairly easily is to use digital cameras and so forth, which can use night vision. And that hasn't been historically possible to do, but are people doing that now? And what can you see with such techniques?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you asked that, because we're actually starting to do that now in Lawwater, where John Wegner has, one of my colleagues has set up some trail master style cameras where when an animal intersects the infrared beam, takes a picture. So candid photo. What happened though was about 20 years ago or so, I was tracking in Lawwater, and I was starting to document when some of the deer were coming into Lawwater, and the coyotes, the red foxes, gray foxes, otters, mink, and a lot of these animals that we don't ordinarily would see them in the day in Lawwater. So the trail cameras then are verifying or predicting from the traces. Now, to use a Georgia coast example, I was on Cumberland Island, I think in 2008 or 2009, might have been. I think it was 2008. And Carol Ruckdeschel and I, on one part of Cumberland, we saw some coyote tracks, and we both went, those are coyote. And Carol says, yes, I've been trying to tell the National Park Service that there are coyotes on the island, but they don't believe me because I keep seeing their tracks, and they say, no, there aren't any coyotes here. So she set up her own camera and finally took a picture of the male female pair of coyotes that were there. And they're like, once she finally had the pictures, then they believed her. And I was like, it's like, we told you so. So this is a really good example, though, of where traces are predictors. And there's a class I teach every other year at Emory for first-year students in the fall that's called How to Interpret Behavior You Did Not See, where the students track animals on and around the Emory campus, and they get to learn who their neighbors are, that they might never see those animals, but they know they're there.
This is Christine's husband, and I have what's probably a stupid question, but there are stupid questions.
No, there aren't.
One now. What happens to the sea turtles who come back to a place that isn't there anymore?
Then they go somewhere else. And actually, yeah, I'm glad you asked that. It's not a dumb question, because the sea turtle researchers in recent years have actually been putting GPS tags on the sea turtles. So the sea turtles, as they're swimming around, you can actually look it up. You can see sea turtles that have been released, for instance, the Jekyll, the Sea Turtle Center on Jekyll, for instance, they've been injured, they get repaired, the vets take care of them, then they do a release of them with the GPS tracker. They can actually see where it is in real time. They then can see whether it comes back to the same beach where it nested, say, year after year. If that beach changes, they will go somewhere else. And the problem is, though, they really do, and I don't know all the reasons why, but they really do want to go back to that same place. There's something in their homing that they're able to do that. The problem then is if that place has changed, and I'll pick on Jekyll again, where Jekyll Island has these big hotels going up with lights, that the babies then, when they hatch, they have been through 100 million years of evolution, they have been conditioned, they have been adapted to go toward the lights, which would be out in the ocean. And if the lights are back there, then what they do is they get confused. So this is another one of the challenges we have, is as the coastline is developed, as it's changed, how we're changing these sea turtle nesting habitats, where first of all, the mothers want to nest in the same places. They come back, it's different, and then they have to waste more energy seeking someplace else. And then secondly, when the hatchlings do emerge, where do they go after that?